Frank, already depressed by his confrontation with Jim and by his lingering nausea, was overwhelmed by what he found on land. His first encounter with chaos and panic came when he and Macklin, carrying Seth between them on the stretcher, left Vagabond late that morning. Frank, in the lead, had not even gotten his feet on the dock when a man in a wet, wrinkled business suit, his greying hair plastered to his forehead, accosted him. "The owner of the trimaran?" the man asked. A woman and 3 children stood behind the fortish man, looking intently. "Yes, I am," Frank replied as he waited for Macklin to lower himself and his end of the stretcher onto the dock. "I want to book passage for myself and my family on a boat going south," the man said, his drawn face belying his calm voice. "I can't help you," Frank answered dully. "We're not going south, and if we were, we'd have a full boat already." "I have gold," the man said, lowering his voice. $15,000 worth. You'll need it wherever you're going." When Macklin put his end of the stretcher momentarily on the end of a bench, Frank rested his on a nearby railing and looked at the man with surprise. "Well, you're $15,000 richer than I am," he said, "but I still can't help you. A trimaran can't take the extra weight." Despite the rain, 5 or 6 other people had clustered around and were listening to this exchange. "Then just take my wife and children," the man said. "They don't weigh much, and they can sleep on deck." "No, Harry," the woman interjected. "I'm not going any place without you. I won't." "We're not going south, I'm afraid," Frank repeated, depressed that a man would be so desperate to leave this place that he was willing to sacrifice himself to get his family on a boat. Depressed, too, that he couldn't help. "Let's go try somewhere else," whispered the wife. Harry, sensing Frank's sympathy, kept staring. The woman tugging at his arm, the youngest child tugging at hers, the rain streaming down everyone's faces. "How about me, Captain?" another man asked. "I'm all alone. I'm a good—" "Me too!" shouted a woman from the back of the small group. The crowd pushed towards Frank, shouting and holding up money. But, picking up the stretcher, he and Macklin plunged roughly through the crowd and strode away. At the hospital, Seth was put on a mat on a garage floor. No doctor or nurse or administrator seemed to know who was responsible for the patients in Barnaby's Ford's garage. So none of the 7 patients lying around the room, some on mats used by the mechanics to work under cars, were being treated. They were out of the wind and rain. That was their treatment. Macklin had quickly disappeared, and Frank crossed the street to the main hospital grounds to find a doctor. He saw a bulldozer digging up one whole section of the side lawn in the rain, an act which struck Frank as senseless. He assumed it was part of some long-range construction program. There were large tarpaulins covering what he thought were building materials, until he saw 2 soldiers carrying a body on a stretcher out onto the rain, across the still untouched section of lawn, and then dumping the body unceremoniously in the mud next to the tarpaulin. An hour later, when he finally left the hospital, the cover had been removed and a pile of corpses was being bulldozed into a muddy hole. Inside the hospital, he discovered there were only 3 doctors left for all of Moorhead City. All the other local doctors had been called up by the army to serve elsewhere. One doctor was asleep, having just put in his 5th consecutive 19-hour day, or close to it. The second was a surgeon working in the OR on those with serious injuries, mostly burns. The third was a paediatrician, who was an acting physician for the other 1,000 or so patients located here or in the refugee centre. Frank appealed to the nurses and the paramedics for help. At one point, when he was exploding in anger at an indifferent and unresponsive nurse, he was dragged away by 2 military policemen, whose purpose was to maintain order in the hospital. In the end, the best he could do was see a nurse write down Seth's name and location and tell him that Seth was 16th on Mr. Umberley's list. Mr. Umberley, he gathered, was one of the 2 paramedics. On his way back to Seth, he wandered by mistake into a room where the authorities apparently were putting patients who had been exposed to severe and presumably lethal doses of radiation. About 10 people were lying against the walls or on the floor of what must normally have been a custodian's room, some groaning, one screaming, and at least 2 of them already dead. The room reeked of vomit. All of those sprawled on the floor were badly burned, and one man who had no eyes and whose face was hideously burned, the skin dangling down one cheek, begged in a sing-song chant for water. Frank fled. When he finally returned to Seth, he found him flushed and breathing rapidly. He explained about the shortage of medical help, but withheld the other horrors he had witnessed. "Well, they warned us," Seth said in his high-pitched, self-mocking tone. "Who warned us? About what?" Frank asked, kneeling down beside him. "Books," Seth said, bright-eyed with fever. "The marchers, the protesters. They all warned us that a nuclear war would be inconvenient. Too many sick and wounded, too few surviving doctors. I would have known better than to get involved in a nuclear war." Frank stared down at him, where he lay on an inch-thick mechanic's mat covered by sailcloth that they used for the stretcher. He couldn't tell if Seth was delirious or not. "It wasn't the Russians and their missiles that got you," Frank said. "It was an American." "I know," said Seth. "They warned us about that too. Someone predicted the Russians would win a full nuclear war because their citizens were unarmed and thus unable to wipe each other out." He grinned up at Frank as if it was all a good joke. I'd like to go to the refugee centre and check on Jean," Frank said. "You think you can handle yourself okay until the doctor comes?" "Of course," Seth replied, still smiling. "I have exactly those qualities that will guarantee my safety in this world." "What's that?" said Frank. "I'm useless and destitute," said Seth, "and I'm even less likely to be visited by a pirate than by a doctor." I've got to go," Frank said. For the first time Seth was silent, staring past Frank at the ceiling, his grin frozen and lifeless. "Will you come back, Frank?" "Come back?" Seth asked in a low, totally different voice. Sure," Frank answered. "I'll come back this evening." "I'd like that," said Seth, still looking past Frank at the garage ceiling. "So I'll be seeing you," said Frank. "Please come back, Frank," Seth whispered desperately through gritted teeth, and Frank, sombre, rose and left. Jean had no illusions about the difficulties she would encounter as a refugee in a strange town, but as she had told Neil, the sea was no home for her. Every moment she had been aboard the Vagabond, her heart had been eyeing the horizon for land. Although she had anticipated scarcity and crowding, when she entered the long, low, modern high school building, she knew that her expectations weren't going to make it any easier. The hall she entered with Jim, Lisa and Skip was crowded with people as wet and weary looking as themselves. The hard floors were covered with mud and water. Some were shouting. A round man with a red nose and bloodshot eyes was trying to herd people into a line, and 25 or 30 confused refugees stood or sat against the walls, a few crying, many looking sick. 4 or 5 had visible burns. Skippy was pulling at Jean's belt and periodically asking her questions about nothing. She could feel a numbness creeping into her, as if her life were again being threatened. With all the sick people around, she wondered whether Jim had brought her to the hospital by mistake rather than the refugee centre. But on the walls were the familiar official graffiti of a school. Seniors taking SATs report on Tuesday to Mr. Owens, graduation rehearsal at 3 o'clock on Thursday, and support your tiger cats. "Mother, let's not stay here," Lisa said, looking frightened. "There's no place else to go, honey," Jean answered mechanically. "We should have stayed on the boat," Lisa insisted. "We've got to try this," Jean replied, fighting off panic as she could feel invading her as it had Lisa. The boat was a refuge of last resort. It had only a few days' worth left of food. This was how people lived on land. It was necessary to try. It took more than an hour before they were registered and assigned to a room. Jim said an awkward goodbye to Lisa, leaving her stricken and silent, and left to sneak back to the boat. They hiked down the hall to find their room, where a large matronly woman welcomed them to the 3rd grade. Forcing a smile, Jean stood tentatively in a doorway and finally urged Skippy and Lisa ahead of her into the room, which was occupied by 4 other families, although there was only one adult male among them. Each group had carved out a little space for itself by arranging the desks in a low wall. Although no mattresses were available, most families seemed to have sleeping bags or blankets, as did Jean. The lights were off, and with the wind and rain slashing against the big windows, the interior of the room was dark and depressing. Skippy, however, seemed to relax in the presence of desks and toys, and began to play by himself with some blocks not far from another child his age, who seemed reluctant to leave his family's walled-off space. There were 7 children in the room. For the next few hours, Jean left Lisa to watch Skippy so she could tour the building and talk with her fellow refugees. She began to realise how lucky she had been. Many had been 100 miles from the nearest blast, and had still been overtaken by radioactive fallout and radiation sickness. Whether they were sick or not, most of those she talked to seemed confused and numb, rather than terrified, and manifested a debilitating passivity. They accepted instructions, food, friendship, and hostility, with a numb equanimity that she knew was a symptom not of spiritual maturity, but of surrender. She was appalled when a young woman who was caring for those with radiation sickness told her that only one doctor was available to come to the centre, and then for only an hour a day. Most of the sick were too weak to go to the hospital and had been instructed to stay in the school where conditions were, in fact, better. "Are you an official here?" Jean asked the young woman, almost afraid to look at the line of ashen slumped figures propped up against one wall of the large 5th grade classroom. "No," the woman answered. "I'm just doing what I can to help. My name's Catania." Catania was a petite, ashen-haired woman in her early 20s, wearing jeans and a sexy peasant blouse with a deep scoop neckline that seemed strangely inappropriate in a room full of sick and dying people. She wore no makeup, and she was not so much pretty as she was striking, especially her dazzling green-blue eyes. Although Jean was still a little shaky from the after-effects of seasickness, she worked for almost 2 hours with Catania, lugging water and food and answering questions. At first she was disturbed by Catania's indifference to and even disobedience of the various officials who appeared sporadically throughout the afternoon. One even ordered them to leave the room because you aren't sick or dying. But she soon came to feel that the only worthwhile things being done were being done spontaneously by volunteers rather than as a result of any official system. After they had fed patients who wanted to eat anything, at 6 o'clock Jean went with Catania to get Lisa and Skip, and they all headed for the school cafeteria with the other refugees. A tall, skinny young man with glasses, apparently Catania's boyfriend, joined them at their table. Food was fried fish, onion soup and water. The cafeteria was packed, and the refugees elbowed into line as if they were scrambling for tickets to a first-run movie. "I've been here almost 3 days," Catania said when Lisa asked her about food. "We had some meat the first day, but since then it's been all eggs, fish and a few vegetables, mostly onions. I think we had some apples the second day, but otherwise no fruit. And the portions keep getting smaller," commented the young man, whose name was Sky. He cleaned his plate of fish away with amazing rapidity and eyed Jean's plate with interest. "I'll give you a joint for half your fish," he offered. It took Jean a moment to absorb the suggestion. "No, thank you," she replied. When I don't finish, I plan to save my children." "That's cool," said Sky, though he was clearly disappointed. "Where are you working?" Jean asked him, more to make conversation out of genuine interest. "Katia and I are working with people in the 5th grade classroom," she explained. "I wondered—" "Oh, no. Katia likes to keep busy," Sky said. "I like to take things easy." "Oh," said Jean. "Actually, I volunteered to help in the kitchen," Sky continued brightly, "but they had enough people already there." "What about military service?" Lisa asked. "Medical disability," answered Sky. "Oh, my mind's screwed up," Sky explained. Katia was eating quietly as if she was indifferent to the conversation. "Do you plan to stay here?" Jean asked, trying to address the question as much to Katia as the young man. "Long as the food holds out," Sky answered, grinning. "Not me," said Katia, her eyes flashing. "The first 2 days I felt safe here, no more. I'd be out in a second if I could figure a way." "Where would you go?" Jean asked, scraping the last of her fish from her plate onto Lisa's. Skippy was having trouble finishing his. "As far away from them where those bombs were going off as I can get," Katia answered. "If it's like this now," she went on, motioning at the crowded cafeteria in implication at the whole refugee centre, "I hate to think how bad it will get." "Perhaps we've already seen the worst," Jean suggested. "All I know," Katia replied, "is that the alive people seem to leave this place after only a day or two. Most of those who stay have already given up." "What about me?" asked Sky with a sly smile. "You gave up so long ago you can't remember when." "Thanks. But then why do you work so hard here?" Jean asked. "Where there's work to be done, I do it," said Katia. "Where there's work to be done, I avoid it," said Sky, grinning. Frank suddenly appeared at their table, standing behind Katia and across from Jean. On his face was a look of relief that he had located her. "Jim's been drafted," he announced it. "No punishment, but they were marching him through the street when I was on my way here. I ought to be happy. I feel like shit." "Where will they send him?" Lisa asked, looking up wide-eyed. "No one knows," Frank said. "He's alive, he's being fed. Eventually he'll be able to serve, that's all that counts." "How can we see him?" Lisa asked. Frank glanced at her painfully and shrugged. "Sit down, Frank," said Jean. "I'll go and get you something to eat." "It's too late," said Sky. "They closed up for the night. You've got to get here early." She turned to grin up at Frank, who was merely walking around the end of the table, and came over to Jean. "Are you okay?" he asked, after a cold look at Sky. "I'm tired," she said. "I'd like you to meet the woman I worked with most of the afternoon. This is Katia. Katia, this is Frank." "Glad to meet you," he said. "You own the trimaran, right?" Katia asked immediately. "Yeah, I do. How do you know?" "Jean's been telling me her adventures," Katia replied. "If you decide to sail again, I'd like to join you. I'm afraid I don't think we're going to be sailing." "You plan to stay here?" "It seems that way," said Frank neutrally. "I'm getting out of here if I have to crawl," said Katia. Her eyes again seemed to flash angrily. Lisa and Skip had gotten up by now, and Skip was pulling his mother's hand to lead them away. As they started to leave, Sky looked up at them, glowy-eyed, and grinned. "Never knock a place that serves free food," he said.